The blizzard raged across Yellowstone like a living thing, devouring everything in its path with a howl that seemed almost human. Snow slashed sideways through the air, reducing the world to a swirling wall of white. Against the broken remains of a fence, a flash of gold stood out. Maggie, the golden Labrador, her soaked coat clinging tightly to her trembling frame. Her red scarf whipped wildly around her neck, a lone scrap of color in the storm's fury. She stood frozen, not from the cold alone, but from the shadows that moved around her, circling closer, growls rising low and dangerous above the screech of the wind. Her amber eyes, wide with fear and unyielding loyalty, searched the chaos desperately. Dr. Samuel Hayes stumbled through the drifts, his heart hammering against his ribs as he caught sight of her fragile figure. He shouted her name, but the wind swallowed the sound whole. All he could do was run faster, each step a silent prayer that he wasn't already too late. Hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Now, let's continue with the story. 3 months earlier, the world had been softer, warmer, filled with the gentle hush of falling snow and the distant ring of Christmas bells. It was Christmas Eve in the small town of Cody, Wyoming, and Samuel had spent the afternoon picking up supplies for the sanctuary. As he crossed the nearly empty parking lot, arms full of bags, something caught his eye. A flash of red near the back fence, barely visible against the snow. Setting the bags down, he trudged toward it. There, huddled in a shallow drift, was a young Labrador, trembling violently. Her fur was patchy and filthy, her ribs visible beneath the dull coat. Around her neck, a tattered red scarf hung like a desperate flag. For a long moment, Samuel stood there, heart sinking. Abandoned. Left to freeze in the Wyoming winter. He crouched low, speaking softly over the wind. "Hey, girl. It's okay. You're safe now." The dog lifted her head, her eyes meeting his, full of exhaustion, hunger, and an almost unbearable flicker of hope. Without hesitation, Samuel shrugged off his jacket and wrapped it around her, lifting her into his arms. She didn't resist. She simply laid her head against his chest and closed her eyes. He named her Maggie on the drive back to Yellowstone. She rode curled on the passenger seat, wrapped in his jacket, the red scarf still tied stubbornly around her neck. She didn't whine or cry. She just shivered and stared at him as if daring herself to believe. Over the weeks that followed, Maggie healed. Under the sanctuary's care, her coat grew thick and golden, her frame filled out with strength. But it was her spirit that changed most. She became the unofficial guardian of the Yellowstone Wildlife Center, accompanying Samuel on his daily rounds, always alert, always patient. With visitors, she was cautious but kind. With injured animals, she was something more, an anchor, a calm presence in a frightening world. There was something about Maggie that no amount of training could replicate. She seemed to sense which creatures needed her most. She would sit silently outside enclosures, offering only her steady presence, until a trembling fawn or a wounded hawk relaxed under her watchful eye. Emily Carter, the young assistant researcher who had quickly bonded with Maggie, often said, "She's more healer than dog." And so Maggie's red scarf became a kind of quiet symbol at the sanctuary, a reminder that healing wasn't always loud or visible. Sometimes it was just a matter of staying, of enduring, of loving without question. The call came one grey morning, snow still sifting lazily from the sky. Samuel stood at his desk, reviewing intake logs, when the phone rang sharply. It was Tyler Brooks, a ranger stationed near the northern boundary. 3 wolf pups, Tyler said, urgency sharpening his voice. Found them huddled near the base of Eagle's Ridge. No sign of the pack. Looks like an avalanche came through overnight. Samuel's heart tightened. Orphaned wolf pups were rare and fragile things. Without intervention, they wouldn't survive. He glanced down to where Maggie lay, curled on the floor, her red scarf tucked neatly beneath her chin. As if sensing his gaze, she lifted her head. "We're on our way," Samuel said. By the time Tyler's truck rolled into the sanctuary's gates, a thin mist of new snow dusted the ground. Maggie stood beside Samuel, her body tense but composed, ears forward, tail low and steady. Tyler opened the truck's rear, revealing a small crate lined with blankets. Inside, 3 tiny bundles of grey fur huddled together, shivering. "They're scared out of their minds," Tyler said grimly. "Didn't even try to bite." Samuel knelt by the crate, studying them. The smallest, with a darker streak across its muzzle, whimpered softly. Another, slightly larger, raised its head and met Samuel's gaze with weary defiance. Maggie stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate. She lowered herself to the ground, pressing her belly flat against the cold earth, her nose twitching. From the crate, one of the pups, a fragile little female, crept hesitantly toward the bars. Maggie gave a soft, almost imperceptible whine. An invitation, a reassurance, the kind of sound no training could teach. Samuel exchanged a glance with Emily, who had appeared silently at his side, clipboard forgotten in her hands. "Let's monitor closely," he said, "but let's see what happens." As night fell and the sanctuary lights glowed warm against the deepening blue of the mountains, Maggie lay curled beside the enclosure, separated from the pups by a thin wire barrier. She didn't bark or paw at the gate. She simply stayed. And on the other side, 3 tiny figures shifted slowly closer, drawn by something ancient and unbreakable. It was the beginning of something none of them yet understood. The next morning dawned brittle and cold, the sanctuary dusted with a thin sheet of new snow that sparkled under the pale sun. Maggie lay curled outside the small enclosure housing the wolf pups, her body still except for the slow rise and fall of her chest. Inside, 3 tiny figures stirred, their wary eyes blinking against the fragile light. Shadow, the largest of the trio, lifted his head first, his nose twitching in the cold air. Willow pressed against him, her slender body trembling slightly, while Ash lingered toward the back, his sharp gaze flitting between Maggie and the wide, unfamiliar world beyond their crate. "Doctor." Samuel Hayes watched from a short distance, arms folded, breath clouding in front of him. Emily Carter stood beside him, a thermos of coffee cradled in her gloved hands. Neither spoke for a long while, unwilling to break the delicate thread of peace stretching between the golden dog and the 3 orphaned pups. It had been Emily's idea to allow Maggie closer contact under supervision. At first, Samuel had resisted. The risks were real. A sudden snap of instinct from the wolf cubs, or an overly enthusiastic move from Maggie, and the fragile bond could shatter. But so far, Maggie had shown nothing but the deepest patience. She stayed just far enough back, offering them the choice to approach her, to trust her on their own terms. It was working, Samuel had to admit. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the distance between Maggie and the pups shrank each day. That morning, something shifted. As Samuel and Emily watched, Willow crept forward, her little paws silent on the straw-covered floor. She hesitated just beyond the wire barrier, her nose twitching furiously. Maggie, sensing her, lifted her head slightly and gave a soft, almost motherly whine. Willow inched closer, emboldened by the gentle sound. With a trembling paw, she reached through the gaps in the wire and batted at the loose end of Maggie's red scarf. Maggie didn't flinch. Instead, she lowered her head again, allowing Willow to tug gently at the scarf, her tail giving a small, encouraging thump against the ground. Moments later, Shadow and Ash moved to join her, their movements hesitant but curious. Together, the three cubs pressed close to the barrier, breathing in Maggie's familiar scent, their small bodies relaxing for the first time since they had arrived. Samuel let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "She's doing it," he murmured. "She's giving them what nothing else could," Emily said softly. "Not food, not shelter, safety." But not everyone at the sanctuary shared their optimism. That afternoon, Mr. Randall summoned Samuel to the administrative building. The director's office, sterile and neat, smelled faintly of disinfectant and cold coffee. Randall sat stiffly behind his desk, tapping a pen against a thick file. "I reviewed the footage," he said without preamble. "I have serious concerns." Samuel kept his expression neutral. "It's supervised. Maggie's behavior has been nothing but exemplary." Randall's mouth thinned. "Today, yes, but they're wild animals, Sam. Their instincts will come in sooner or later. When that happens, your dog could get hurt. Or worse, the wolves could imprint incorrectly. You're risking everything we've built for sentiment." Samuel's fists curled at his sides, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I'm following protocol, constant monitoring. No unsupervised contact. The pups are thriving, Randall. They're eating. They're growing, and they're trusting again." Randall sighed, rubbing his temples. "I'm not unsympathetic, Sam. But remember your responsibility here. Sentimentality doesn't save lives. Preparation does." Leaving the meeting, Samuel found himself heavier with doubt. He knew Randall wasn't wrong. Nature was brutal, and wolves were not pets. Yet when he returned to the enclosure and saw Maggie lying calmly, Willow tucked against her side, Shadow gnawing playfully at her ear, Ash batting at her tail with cautious mischief, the weight lifted slightly. Whatever rules governed the wild, something older and deeper was at work here, something worth fighting for. As days folded into weeks, the bond only grew stronger. Maggie became not just a surrogate mother, but their anchor. She taught them through example, patience when they fought over scraps of food, forgiveness when play turned rough, protection when strange noises startled them. She never barked, never snapped, only used her body language, her quiet presence to guide. Shadow grew bolder, stalking Maggie's shadow with exaggerated stealth before pouncing with uncoordinated glee. Ash, clever and cautious, observed and learned, mimicking Maggie's movements with uncanny precision. Willow remained the heart, the most affectionate, always seeking the warmth of Maggie's side when night fell. Emily captured every moment she could with her camera, compiling a log of images and notes that would eventually tell the story that words alone could not. One evening, as twilight bled into a deep indigo sky, Samuel sat on the bench near the enclosure, Maggie resting at his feet. Inside, the three wolf cubs tumbled and played, their bodies growing stronger, their movements more confident. The sanctuary lights cast long, soft shadows, and for a moment it felt like the world outside, the rules, the fears, the what-ifs, didn't exist. Samuel reached down absently stroking Maggie's head. "You're doing more for them than we ever could," he said quietly. Maggie's tail thumped once against the ground, as if she understood. But deep down, Samuel knew this peace was temporary. The pups were growing fast. Sooner rather than later, nature would call them back to the wild where they truly belonged. And Maggie, for all her love, would have to find a way to let them go. The thought settled in his chest like a stone. But for tonight, he chose to stay in the moment, letting hope linger a little longer under the stars. The wind carried the first true bite of winter across the sanctuary, sweeping over the fields and rattling the bare branches of the cottonwoods. Maggie lay outside the training yard, her golden coat now thick with the season's chill, watching the 3 wolf cubs with a mixture of pride and something quieter, heavier. Shadow led the way, his paws striking the ground with a growing assurance that spoke of the wildness awakening inside him. Ash, always alert and calculating, flanked him like a shadow, sharp-eyed and sure. Willow lagged slightly behind, glancing back often, her heart still tethered somewhere between the world Maggie had shown her and the call of the wild in her blood. From the observation deck above, Dr. Samuel Hayes leaned against the railing, his breath misting in the crisp air. Emily Carter stood beside him, camera slung loosely around her neck, silent for once. They both knew what was coming. The cubs were no longer the helpless bundles they had rescued months ago. Their bodies had lengthened, their muscles hardened. Their play had turned to sparring, their yips to low, guttural growls. Nature was stirring, and no amount of human intervention or love could stop it. "They're ready," Emily said quietly, her voice tight with emotion. Samuel nodded, though the motion felt like a betrayal. They have to be. The plan was already in motion. In a few days, the wolf cubs would be introduced into one of the sanctuary's larger wolf packs, a semi-wild group prepared to take them in, teach them the final lessons Maggie could not. Survival, hierarchy, the unbreakable code of the wild. That evening, Samuel sat by the fire pit behind the main building, Maggie at his feet. Her red scarf, worn and faded, fluttered gently in the breeze. He stroked her head absently, staring into the flames, thinking about all they had asked of her and all they were about to take away. Maggie shifted, resting her chin on his knee, her amber eyes steady on his face, as if she knew, as if she understood in that quiet, unfathomable way she always had. The next morning was clear and brutally cold. Staff moved carefully, setting up transport crates along the training yard's edge. The cubs sensed the tension, their movements sharp, wary. Maggie sat a few feet away, her tail motionless, her ears pricked forward. As the handlers approached with thick gloves and steady hands, Shadow bared his teeth, Ash backed away into a defensive crouch, and Willow whimpered, pressing against the fence. Maggie stood then, and without a sound, walked slowly to the fence's edge. She lowered herself into a laying position, paws outstretched, her body relaxed. Shadow's ears flicked, Ash's head tilted. Willow's whole body quivered with hesitation. Then, one by one, they moved toward her. No barriers now. No safety nets, only trust. Willow was the first to press her small body against the wire, nuzzling at the tattered red scarf. Maggie licked her nose through the gaps, a single slow swipe of her tongue, a benediction. Ash followed, pressing his forehead briefly against Maggie's paw. Shadow came last, but he stood tall, pressing his nose to Maggie's cheek, a silent vow. The staff moved quickly, respectfully. In less than an hour, the cubs were loaded into secure crates, bound for the larger enclosure at the sanctuary's far end. As the truck rumbled away, Maggie sat alone by the empty training yard, the snow swirling around her. Emily knelt beside her, wrapping an arm around her sturdy frame. "You did good, girl," she whispered. Maggie leaned into her briefly before pulling away. She walked slowly to the gate, where a scrap of red fluttered from the latch. It was her scarf, caught and torn loose during the goodbyes. Maggie picked it up in her mouth, carried it carefully back to the middle of the empty yard, and dropped it there, a single bright mark against the snow. Samuel watched from the deck, feeling something fracture deep inside his chest. Maggie had understood. She had let them go. The weather turned that evening, fast and brutal. The sky, a pale, sickly grey all afternoon, darkened into an ominous black, and by nightfall the first howling gusts shook the sanctuary's walls. A blizzard warning blared from the emergency radios. Staff rushed to secure the animals, checking locks and latches, laying down extra feed. Samuel and Emily moved through the compound with grim efficiency, but Maggie was nowhere to be found. Panic flared sharp and immediate in Samuel's chest. He called for her, voice shredded by the rising wind, while Emily checked the staff buildings and sheds. Nothing. Then Samuel saw it, the faint trail of paw prints, already filling with snow, leading toward the direction of the wolf enclosure. "No," he breathed, the word barely audible against the gale. Without thinking, he grabbed his coat and plunged into the storm. Maggie was running back to them, to the cubs she had raised, to the family she had lost. And Samuel knew. This time there would be no fence between them and the wild. The storm roared like a beast unleashed, tearing across the open plains of Yellowstone, flinging snow sideways in thick, blinding sheets. Dr. Samuel Hayes fought against the wind, each step a brutal struggle as he followed the faint trail left in the fresh snow. His lungs burned with cold, his legs screamed with the effort, but he didn't stop. Somewhere out there, Maggie was running into the heart of the wild, into a world that might not remember her as anything but prey. The memory of her golden coat, her red scarf trailing like a wounded banner, burned in his mind. He called her name again, but the gale ripped the sound away, leaving only the hollow wail of the storm. Ahead, he saw the broken fence of the wolf enclosure, the heavy metal gate hanging twisted from its hinges. His heart clenched. Maggie had slipped through, straight into the domain of the full-grown wolves who had never known her scent, her touch, her love. Inside the enclosure, the world was a chaos of movement and shadows. Maggie stood alone in the clearing, her body low but unyielding, her tail tucked, her ears pinned flat against her head. The adult wolves circled her, their bodies taut with suspicion and dominance. Their low growls vibrated through the ground itself. Maggie didn't move. She didn't bare her teeth or snap. She made herself small, unthreatening, but she did not run. Her amber eyes, bright and clear, flicked from wolf to wolf, and then, almost as if sensing Samuel's distant presence, she lifted her head slightly, the red scarf at her throat trembling in the wind. A low snarl broke the tense air as one of the larger wolves lunged forward, teeth bared, muscles rippling. Maggie flinched but held her ground. Then a blur of motion cut through the white. Shadow barreled into the path of the attacking wolf, his young body colliding hard, knocking the aggressor off balance. Ash followed a breath later, positioning himself at Maggie's flank, head low, lips curled in a silent warning. Willow circled wide, her body weaving between Maggie and another wolf that had started to move in from the side. The three young wolves, grown strong and fierce under Maggie's silent guidance, stood as a living barrier between her and the wildness that threatened to consume her. For a moment, the adult wolves hesitated, reading the body language of the young protectors. Confusion rippled through their ranks. This was not prey behavior. This was pack behavior, and Maggie, somehow, impossibly, had been accepted within it. The challenge faded as quickly as it had begun. One by one, the adult wolves lowered their heads, tails dropping in signs of reluctant submission. The pack, by instinct more than thought, had absorbed Maggie into their fragile, feral family. Samuel reached the edge of the clearing just in time to see Maggie lean her body into Shadow's side, her frame trembling with exhaustion, her muzzle pressed briefly against his thick fur. Ash and Willow brushed against her, too, their gestures unspoken but unmistakable. Relief hit Samuel so hard he nearly sagged to his knees. He stayed at the edge, not daring to approach yet, not wanting to shatter the delicate balance they had achieved. Later, when the winds died and the snow settled into a deep, eerie silence, Samuel and Emily, with the help of the other staff, coaxed Maggie back toward the sanctuary buildings. It wasn't easy. Maggie kept glancing back toward the enclosure where Shadow, Willow, and Ash stood watching, their bodies outlined against the bruised purple sky. Emily knelt in the snow, tears frozen on her lashes, holding out the old, tattered red scarf. After a long, heartbreaking moment, Maggie trotted toward her, her head low, and allowed herself to be led away. In the weeks that followed, life at Yellowstone returned to a new kind of normal. The wolf pack thrived with the addition of its new, spirited members. Shadow, now larger and leaner, often led the younger hunts. Ash became a natural strategist, and Willow, once so hesitant, blossomed into a graceful and fearless scout. Visitors marveled at the pack's strength and strange cohesion, never knowing the true story behind their fierce unity. Maggie grew older in those months, her muzzle whitening, her pace slowing. Yet every morning she insisted on walking the trails near the wolf enclosure, her steps steady, her nose lifting into the wind as if catching the distant scent of her children. Samuel built a special path through the sanctuary grounds, a quiet, winding trail lined with wildflowers and pine trees. At the trailhead, they placed a young sapling, a pine that would grow tall and strong with time. Around its slender trunk, they tied Maggie's old red scarf, a symbol of everything she had given and everything she had endured. They named it Maggie's Trail. On warm afternoons, visitors could sometimes spot 3 wolves lying near the fence where the trail curved closest to the enclosure, their bodies relaxed, their eyes half closed in the sun. And not far away, under the shelter of the growing pine, Maggie would rest, her golden coat blending into the dappled light, her breathing slow and content. Some bonds, Samuel realized, ran deeper than blood or instinct. Some promises were made not with words, but with actions, with staying when it would have been easier to leave, with loving even when letting go was inevitable. Maggie had come to them as something broken. She had given all she had to creatures who might never have understood the depth of her gift, and in return, she had been made whole. Under the wide, endless skies of Yellowstone, where the wind carried the scent of pine and freedom, the golden Labrador and her wild children kept a quiet, timeless vigil. A family forged not by nature's laws, but by something older and far stronger. I hope you enjoyed this story. Subscribe to my channel so you don't miss touching stories. Leave a like and then comment below what you thought of the emotional stories. See you in the next video.